right. Good evening, everyone. I think we have a few people still wandering in and finding seats, but I'll just go ahead and kick us off so we can get started tonight. Welcome to the Historic New Orleans Collection. My name is Amanda McFillin. I'm the Associate Director of Museum Programs, and we're so excited to see a full house tonight. This is amazing. Before I introduce our panelists for the evening, I just wanted to make a few announcements about things happening at the collection, which I think y'all might be interested in. If you have not had a chance to see our new exhibition, New Orleans, the Founding Era, we really encourage you to go see it. In fact, it was open tonight for extended viewing right before the program. Did anybody have a chance to go over and see it? Okay, I see a few hands. How many of y'all have seen the exhibition so far? Oh, that's wonderful. We're really excited about this exhibition. It's our tricentennial exhibition celebrating the founding of our city and the many different people who were here in New Orleans at that time. We have loans that are coming in from all over the world, from France and Spain and Canada and around the country as well. And it's really a fantastic show. And because of those loans, it's actually only here for a limited time. It's here for 3 months. It ends on May 27th. So please hurry up and see it while you still have a chance. It's a really fantastic show. And it's at our museum at 533 Royal Street, I should say. We also have a couple of programs coming up that I wanted to tell you all about. On April 4th, which is a Wednesday, on April 4th, we are going to be commemorating the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And we are going to be showing a really wonderful documentary. It's a PBS-produced documentary called The March, which is about the March on Washington in 1963 and about Dr. King's role in that. And it's really incredible. We'll have Bill Roussel, who's a local community leader, who's going to be talking about Dr. King's legacy here in New Orleans before the documentary. So we really hope that y'all can join us for that. It's on April 4th at 6 p.m. in this room. Also, in April, at April 24th, another Founding Era related program that we're going to be doing is the Tunica Biloxi and the Rise of Louisiana. So we're going to be joined by John Barbary, who is the Director of Development and Programming at the Tunica Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana. He and I will be in conversation talking about the Tunica Biloxi, their history here in Louisiana, and also their present-day efforts to revitalize the Tunica language. It's a really interesting project that they're doing right now. We'll also be talking about their museum in Marksville, which is an incredible museum, and some of the collections that they have there related to their history. So that's April 24th. That's also going to be at 533 Royal Street. So you'll be able to see the exhibition and then come join us for that program. It starts at 6 o'clock. And as you can see, our programs are filling up pretty quickly these days. So if you're interested in coming to any of these programs, we encourage you to email us or call or even stop by the desk on your way out and make a reservation for some of those events so you can be sure to have a seat in the room. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that if you are not already a member of the collection, we love our members here, and they help us do all of these wonderful programs throughout the year. So we would love to have you as a member. If you'd like more information about that, we have membership brochures available, or just talk to anybody on staff about our membership programs. So thank you. So now I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists for the evening. The way we're going to do things is I will introduce our speakers now, then they will be able to come up one by one, and they're each going to do a 15-minute or so presentation, and then afterwards we're all going to sit down at the table again for your Q&A with y'all. So our first speaker is Ryan Gray. Ryan Gray is the Richard Wallen Babel Endowed Professor of Anthropology at the University of New Orleans. He has worked in New Orleans archaeology for almost 20 years, and he has developed a number of research projects in the city on topics ranging from the African-Native interactions in colonial New Orleans to the spiritual churches of the 20th century. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and his first book on race segregation and the birth of public housing in New Orleans will be out in early 2019. Our second speaker is Michael Godzinski. Michael Godzinski's professional cultural resource management experience includes a wide variety of projects in several different capacities, including archaeologist, architectural historian, and research diver. He has worked at Earth Search Incorporated since 1999. He is Secretary of Interior Professional Qualification Standards qualified in archaeology, architectural history, and history. He also had extensive training in marine environments, completing the Florida State University's academic diver and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers working diver courses. He has participated as the lead diver in several marine Earthsearch Inc. projects, most recently off the Chandeleur Islands in Louisiana. And finally, Elizabeth Williams is an assistant project manager from Earthsearch Incorporated, a local cultural resource management consulting firm. She has worked with Earthsearch for 4 years, in part specializing in colonial ceramics. Elizabeth was part of the team from ESI that the Historic New Orleans Collection contracted to research and curate the select portions of their collections from the French founding era, including portions of the Signouret-Brulatour house that Earthsearch also excavated and monitored. So now I'm going to welcome Brian Gray to come to the podium. Thank you all.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out. The 2018 Tricentennial is here, of course. I'm sure you've heard that 1,000 times already, and you'll hear it 1,000 more before the end of this year. But it makes it a good time for those of us with an interest in the city's history, and a good, if busy, time for the city's archaeologists. I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with the broad panorama of the city's history, the founding as a modest settlement in 1718 along an old native portage shown to Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville by a Bayou Gula Indian guide some years before, and the city remained an underdeveloped backwater through much of the 18th century. A product of continual cultural negotiation between isolated Euro-American settlers, Native American tribes, and enslaved Africans. In the era of Spanish colonial rule, lasting until 1802, the city was transformed both demographically and more catastrophically when two fires in 1788 and 1794 destroyed much of the city. Over the next 2 centuries, of course, the city would see any number of other changes. New Orleans became one of the great port cities of the country, allowing some to accumulate enormous wealth at the expense of profound suffering for others, as the city also became one of the most important markets for the traffic in humans in the antebellum South. In the period after emancipation, the patterns of racial segregation and discrimination later laid bare in Hurricane Katrina became deeply entrenched in the urban landscape. And despite this, New Orleans also became home to a vibrant Creole culture expressed in food and music and visual arts and performance and architecture, blending influences from Europe, from Africa, and from indigenous America to create something entirely new. The archaeology I'll be discussing here, to me, tells a story of New Orleans from its underside, quite literally a story occurring beneath the surface, a neglected colonial experiment that came to epitomize the luxury of a slave society, a place where sexuality and racial ambiguity was sometimes celebrated and sometimes feared and sometimes bought and sold, and a city whose gray areas and disorderly margins allowed for the birth of this very particular blend of cultures that we still celebrate. Now, in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on recent archaeology in the French Quarter, especially that dealing with the colonial history of the city. And it's something of an irony that most of the projects that I'll be talking about today, and the work made possible by the Historic New Orleans Collection at the Brulatour House that Mike and Elizabeth will be discussing as well, occurred because of interested property owners who made properties accessible to archaeologists even though they didn't have to. As I'm fond of pointing out, the city boasts in the Zooarchaeology Commission one of the oldest organizations devoted to protecting a historic district in the country, given authority in 1936 by the state constitution. And yet there are no protections at the local level for what is below the ground, nor any acknowledgement that it might be significant at an official level. After Mike and Elizabeth speak, I'm going to actually wrap up with a few more thoughts on that, and perhaps something of a call to action, but I'll get back to that later. So to get really into the archaeology, my own specialty is pottery, so you'll see it fairly frequently in the course of my presentation. It's one of the basic tools of the archaeologist, and perhaps archaeologists put a bit too much stock in it as a result, but it tells us about many different things. We can tell where it came from, often anyway, who made it and when. It thus can give us insights into who was present at a site at a particular time, what economic networks they were a part of. It can tell us about activities, about the social role of food, about foodways more generally, the rituals of dining. Its decorations and forms give us insights into values, into worldviews, into aesthetics, into culture more broadly speaking. It can be a vehicle for communicating wealth and status, power and identity. But like all material things, it does not just communicate these things as a static marker. It's part of how identities are performed. And it's actually what we have to mark some of the earliest sites in existence in Orleans Parish, some of the earliest archaeological sites, the shell middens of the Chifuncta culture, 2,000-year-old sites and older in New Orleans East. Louisiana's first humans to make pottery on a wide scale, outside of the French Quarter, but still part of this broad story we're talking about. As indigenous peoples persisted in the New Orleans area, and many of the sites associated with them in New Orleans proper, in the city proper, have undoubtedly been lost to development, or now submerged, or deeply buried under alluvium from the river. And evidence for contact period native sites is rare along the city's riverfront where we are now. There are a couple of locations coming to light, including at a site that we're actually on top of right now, 535 Conti Street, where we found a smattering of Native American pottery that gives us some evidence about settlement here predating European arrival. But most of this has probably been obliterated. Now, up until relatively recently, the body of archaeological data from the early part of the 18th century in New Orleans was also somewhat dissatisfying. While the city's colonial era was often the goal of some of the first substantial excavations to take place in the city in the 1970s and 1980s, and I've been scanning the archives of photographs that are in the files at UNO, and there are some great shots of these 1970s excavations. There were projects at the Herman Grima House in the French Quarter, at Madame John's Legacy in 1971, even excavations at Armstrong Park and Congo Square in the late 70s, that ironically were much more concerned with finding remains of Fort San Fernando, the Spanish-era bastion, than looking at the use and development of Congo Square itself. Looking back on this work, it was foundational to what we do now, but it was also, there were some issues with it. Often there was a lack of secure and well-stratified context, incomplete reporting. At this time, historical archaeology as a discipline was still in its early stages, and people were still struggling to find the sort of voice that historical archaeology could offer. On top of that, it was also hard to find stratigraphic separation that allowed us to attach specific finds to very specific time periods. The fact that so much of New Orleans was built quite literally on a mucky quagmire means that early ground surfaces are frequently jumbled together. In other words, it can be very difficult to separate material from the French era from later materials that are intermixed, trampled down into it. Now, work since the late 90s has really begun to rectify this. And occasionally there are large and well-funded and planned projects that come as a result of concerted action on the part of multiple institutions. Shannon Dowdy of the University of Chicago's work at St. Anthony's Garden is one example of this. I'll say a little bit about it since she couldn't be here with us this evening. The project was initially supported by the Getty Foundation to get information to inform the restoration of the garden, which was badly damaged by Hurricane Katrina. Then received additional funding from the NSF and the NEH to extend that work to further in the garden and to the Ursuline Convent. The garden was a complex multi-component site from an archaeological standpoint, a space where the poles of the secular and the religious, the public and the private, pulled back and forth throughout the area's history. Because it had been protected from development, there were parts of the site with well-preserved French colonial layers, including what Shannon has interpreted as the remains of fire pits associated with an informal marketplace to the rear of the church in the 1730s and 1740s. The French period in New Orleans is marked by the presence archaeologically of faience, tin-enameled pottery made in France with a soft earthenware fabric and a glazed outer surface, sometimes with painted decoration, as in the example here that was associated with one of those fire rings. Found also in association with items associated with intercultural exchange otherwise. Bits of native pottery, smoking pipes, beads, even a lead baling seal, these seals that were attached to products for export from France that identified where they were manufactured and volumes and things like that. That's what this is over here. Now, projects like this are really the rarity in the French Quarter. More often, urban projects take place with a little bit of happenstance, a little bit of luck, and sometimes that luck is bad. Sometimes it's downright catastrophic. And the collapse of the building at 810 Royal Street. Oh, sorry. One of the other significant things at the garden site was the remains of things that predated the street grid being laid out. This is a very early palmetto structure that was excavated there. Some of you have probably heard about this before. It probably mimicked the structures that you see on the 1721 plan or image of Biloxi. So catastrophe allows us access to things for archaeology as well. And the collapse of a building down the street on Royal Street in 2014 created such an opportunity. A victim of termites and neglect, the new owners knew that the permitting process for new construction in this high-profile location, practically around the corner from the cathedral, would be slow. And they thought that an archaeological dig would be a good way to help make up for the loss of the building. The ground under that building had been a little altered since it was built in 1801. And showed you this slide before. It was a little bit of foreshadowing. This is the building that collapsed. It's the late 19th century view, and just a few years before that building collapsed. Now, the building there had preserved in place intact layers associated with the 1788 fire, with other construction episodes on the block, but perhaps most remarkably, intact layers associated with the early part of the colonial era. When a man named Augustin Langlois, a fur trader who came to New Orleans with his two brothers in the 1720s, was associated with the lot. There was a remarkable amount of Native American pottery, French faience, Chinese porcelain, but also things having to do with commerce and trade. Again, these lead baling seals, French gun flints, beads, smoking pipes, and the occasional coin, the 1722 9 denier coin, being something that would have made the voyage back and forth across the Atlantic at least 3 times in its own life. The coin was minted for circulation in Canada. The Canadians didn't want to use it because it was undervalued. Almost all of them were shipped back to France, and then France unloaded them on the Louisiana colony, which was constantly cash poor. So we find lots of them here in New Orleans, relatively speaking, quite a few of them. Augustin Langlois was a pretty fascinating character himself. He was born in Quebec in 1692, a voyager engaged in the Indian trade, and he left Canada to seek his fortune here in the Louisiana colony, also spending time in Mobile before heading back to the Illinois country. He married a woman named Maria Baudreau, also referred to as Marie Lafortune. While on these journeys, a woman born in Detroit to parents who also made that journey from French Canada to Mobile. Langlois died in 1749 back in Quebec at the age of 57. Such people are interesting to me because they were already Creole in the sense that they were born in this country, and they provided vectors for the entry of other types of culture into the city. We also happen to know that Langlois was himself a slaveholder, as it was an enslaved man who belonged to Langlois who attacked Louis Congo, the city's executioner, something that Dr. Dowdy has discussed in some detail in her book, Building the Devil's Empire. And we now suspect that we may have uncovered remains of a structure that could have housed the enslaved on this property at 810 Royal Street, with some of the material record associated with it giving us unprecedented insights into the conditions of slavery at this founding generation of the city. The remains here and at St. Anthony's Garden, and at other sites in the French Quarter too, are making us question and rethink the degree to which early New Orleans was also a native and an African city, one in which the porous boundaries allowed the development of new cultural forms, something we formerly only glimpsed fragmentarily and on the city's outskirts. And here, just in comparison, some native pottery from 810 Royal, and this is probably the most famous piece of native pottery from previous excavations in the city. This is from the Tremé plantation, where St. Augustine Catholic Church is now, and it's a fragment of pottery with an alphabet, of native pottery with an alphabet inscribed in the brim. Something that becomes common in 19th century pottery later, where you have this sort of didactic alphabet pottery for teaching children the alphabet. Unfortunately, almost the entire assemblage of material from the Tremé plantation is lost now, a victim of Hurricane Katrina. It was thrown out. People didn't realize what it was when it had got soaked by the waters. So, on back to a happier note, our project at 810 Royal Street has now been going on and off for 3 years, and we're continuing to make discoveries and trying to apply what we're finding in new ways. We realize now that we have a particularly rich sample of animal bone, especially from colonial era fish. So we've now begun a project working with a zooarchaeologist and Ryan Kennedy and Martin O'Connell from the Pontchartrain Institute at UNO to look at human stresses on the environment through the health of fish populations, changes in the size of fish being caught over time compared to contemporary populations, thinking about how human stress is impacting the health of coastal fisheries. Now, this is a long-term research project that kind of came out of happenstance. We do small one-off projects too, and I won't really mention too many of them here, but I'll mention one just because I think it's a fun comparison and a fun way to think about just the randomness of some of the things that we can find, but that end up having a lot of research potential as well. We were invited by a property owner to excavate inside a detached kitchen at a spot on St. Peter Street, 936 St. Peter Street. And as is kind of typical for that kind of site, we found a privy. Privies are one of the basic things that archaeologists love. They serve as convenient repositories for trash. They're like little time capsules with everything left behind in them. And this one was no different, and there was lots of domestic debris. This is just a small sample of it. But what was really so fascinating about this is kind of typical of what you might find in a 19th century privy. This privy we came to call the goat head privy, because there were literally hundreds of goat heads discarded in the privy in a relatively short span of time. This is just from on the table. This is from one about 10 centimeter level within that privy. Goat jaws, the rears of the skulls, and to quote our zooarchaeologists, they were quite literally beat the hell out of. They were slaughtered very messily, and people were obviously trying to get to their brains, which were apparently being used at a household level sort of tanning, hide processing operation, which is one of those handy things that you can do with animal brains. This was supported by other artifacts as well. There's lace bobbin needles. There were 2 tailors who lived at that site for just a couple of years, and yet they are the ones who ended up leaving this sort of rich archaeological record behind that we can connect to the historic documents. Obviously, the support and involvement of institutions like the Louisiana State Museum, the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Archdiocese, they're essential to what we do. Other projects also take private property owners being proactive about what might be intact on their property. And that's really one of the reasons why we know so much now about the last site I'll talk about before turning it over to Mike and Elizabeth. The St. Peter Street Cemetery, which was New Orleans' primary colonial era burial ground, a very dramatic example of this. This was a below-ground cemetery located within the French Quarter on the block bounded by St. Peter, Rampart, Toulouse, and Burgundy Streets. I'd always say is where Mama Rose's Pizza used to be. And those of you who have been around for a while will remember that, and it will mark it for you. Well, it was used for burials from at least 1725 to 1789, intermittently until into the 1790s or later. It served all of the city's Catholic population, both enslaved and free, whether of European, Native American, or African ancestry. When it was closed, the ownership of the property was disputed, and both the Cabildo and the church claimed it. The Cabildo subdivided and auctioned the block around 1800. It was still marked on maps 1801. Eventually, the new American territorial authorities recognized that auction as legal, even though the church had refused to move any of the bodies that had been interred there. The cemetery has been rediscovered a few times, actually. A report in the Times Democrat of 16th June 1893 describes 3 coffins uncovered as a well was being dug on the property. And not quite 100 years later, the November 11th, 1972 Times-Picayune references a similar find on the Maison Dupuis Hotel site. None of these caused much concern at the time, but the discovery of even more graves in 1984 caused enough controversy that archaeologists were actually given access to the lot during construction of some condominiums. And what many people don't realize about that project is it was taking place after the foundations were already poured, after the forms were already poured. The archaeologists just came in and salvaged. It eventually turned out to be 31 burials. Most of them interpreted as belonging to people who were enslaved in life, based on evidence of strenuous labor and violence and African ancestry. Now, in fact, one set of artifacts from these excavations is actually in the founding era exhibit right now. This suite of religious medals and rosary that was interred with a man with filed and notched front teeth in a style that is associated with the Congo region of Central Africa. One of the interesting things about this gentleman, he's been the source of a lot of speculation, and being able to re-examine the medallions, the religious medals with him, we can see that one of them, we have St. Joseph, very appropriate considering that yesterday was St. Joseph's Day. And on the other side of it, St. Camillus of Lelis. St. Camillus was the patron of doctors and nurses. And so I think that this gentleman was identified by these markers of African ancestry, the filed teeth, but also by these religious medals, as someone whose life's work involved taking care of illness and health of others. My own firsthand experience with the St. Peter Street Cemetery came in 2011 when we were contacted by a property owner who was preparing to build a swimming pool during a renovation on Rampart Street. And if he had proceeded, if he hadn't called us, it's likely that no one would have ever known a thing about what was being destroyed on the site. Because he contacted us in advance, we were able to excavate some 15 burials in a 10-foot by 20-foot area, document many more that stayed in place. There are actually more underneath the swimming pool that was built there. They extended deeper into the ground. They continued underneath the foundations of buildings constructed in the 19th and 20th century. They were so dense that graves were dug through one another, and bones from those disturbed historically are scattered through the soil beginning at a depth of 4 feet. These went to the forensics lab at LSU for analysis before being returned here for reburial. Again, the majority of these were the remains of people of African descent, although there was also a significant number of mixed African and Native American ancestry, a visceral reminder of the connections that the city's Black Indians have been telling us about for decades. Most were buried with nothing. They were probably simply wrapped in shrouds upon being buried. But there was an exception again, an individual buried with This individual, an elderly man, also probably of African descent, was buried with this suite of items: a hand-built clay pipe with peck-marked decoration, flints for lighting it, some kind of carnivore tooth that can be identified, things that were probably held in a small pouch on the body. A bundle like this, a pouch like this, can have meanings in both Native American and African cultural traditions, and the style of the pipe has analogs in both. And so he's someone, again, that these items mark him especially as having some sort of special status in life. On the morning of April 28th, 2015, we held a series of events to honor those buried at the St. Peter's site, with the participation of the Archdiocese, St. Augustine Catholic Church, the Umoja Committee, local cultural organizations celebrating the city's African heritage. And Linda Harris from St. Augustine and Sabrina Montana from Umoja really took the lead on this. NOMA helped. At the time they were hosting the Congo Across the Waters exhibit, we held a memorial mass and then ceremonies at the gravesite celebrating the African, the Native American heritage, the Catholic heritage of the people buried at the cemetery. There have undoubtedly been other people who encountered and disturbed human remains on the St. Peter's site over the years, perhaps some unknowingly. So the public ceremony was important to me on a number of levels. It brought attention to the existence of the site. There are, after all, thousands of the city's former residents buried there still. Even more importantly, to my knowledge, the reburial event was the first like it in New Orleans, a testament to the increased attention to the ethical and legal responsibilities of archaeologists to descendant populations, including how human remains are treated after death. The St. Peter Project represents one of those archaeological opportunities that fell through the cracks in years past, and it was exceptional. We only deal with excavating human remains when there's a compelling need to keep them from being otherwise disturbed. And we rely largely on the goodwill of property owners to gain access to properties and do this sort of thing. All of these things provide a reminder to us about the complexity of the identities at work in the city in the 18th century. And I'll say a few words about that to wrap up, and I think I'm running a little bit long, and so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next speakers, and then I'll come back to wrap up for just a few moments at the end of this. Thank you very much.
And now we're going to get a little more specific to just one site. I think we can work with that. Okay. In 2013, H&O approached us about excavations at the newly acquired Signouret-Brulatour house. Shown here in this 1930s Charles Frank photograph shows the mansion with numerous shop fronts on the first floor, the entresol on the second floor, and the main living space on the third floor. The 1896 Sanborn fire insurance map with the Signouret parcel highlighted in tan shows the property consisting of two main shops in the front, separated by a carriageway with rear ancillaries flanking the courtyard. And the very back of the property is marked wine and liquor storage, as both Brulatour and Signouret were alcohol merchants. The red line in this area signifies where we found the oldest archaeological deposit on the site, and that'll be the subject of our focus today. The area highlighted in blue is a separate property that was also the subject of the massive renovation project set forth by the HNOC. This was once part of the rear of the St. Louis Hotel, and the area in purple was also part of the project, and that was an ice house in the 1896 map. These three properties were consolidated during the mid 20th century tenure of the WDSU TV station. The main archaeological excavations took place in the tan area, with the blue area and the purple areas consisting of limited monitoring and shovel testing. Another shot of the Royal Street frontage of the Signouret house with the old St. Louis Hotel on the right there that was soon to be demolished. And as you can see in this 1916 photo, just the rotunda was left during this photograph here, and the Signouret house is visible to the left of the rotunda. The rotunda was most infamous for its slave auctions. The rotunda also extended onto the parcel in the rear, which fronted on Toulouse Street. You see how the rotunda is extending there. Now this was a separate property. This is what became the TV station. Today, the St. Louis Hotel property is occupied by the Omni, and the blue line running through the rotunda signifies that is a separate property. In the mid-20th century, the TV station occupied, that's the property there. You can see Toulouse Street is to the rear there, and the, the projection room. And this is a little diagram of the floor plan. The projection room is in the bottom there, and the red line all the way in the right side is the common wall with the Signouret house. Switching gears to the present study, we were really only concerned with the tan shaded area, which was the Signouret-Brulatour property. Now, this is a map of our survey excavations. We have the courtyard and carriageway marked by the squiggly little lines, and the little round and square shovel tests are highlighted in black, were followed by limited formal excavation units in the crosshatched areas. We excavated a well with all kinds of goodies too in it. That's the large red area in the courtyard, and the rest of the red areas signify the architectural features that were identified. The purple areas were inaccessible to us, as were the blank areas on the map in the back. Not much happened back there. The HNOC should be commended for doing as much as they did, even though we didn't have time or resources to do a lot more than we could have. But everyday construction projects in the French Quarter go unregulated and wholesale destroy important archaeological deposits that could help augment our already rich record. I work on a lot of sites that are federally mandated, and this is not federally mandated, so the HNOC just wanted to do something right. This excavation unit here was conducted in the Down Riverside shop, and it highlights the difficulty of finding the early colonial deposits. The very top of the photo at the signboard shows a brick floor that was likely laid down in the later 19th century. Below is a deposit with a high concentration of oyster shells. You can see the shells here and how it was almost dug like a pit. This stratigraphy here is broken by the pit, and there's shells all up in here. A very thin black line below is indicative of the 1794 fire, and below that is another line with the 1788 fire. This is about, let me go back. We have a heavy layer of silty clay down in here, and approximately about 5 feet we hit water. The lower level of this unit still contained creamware, indicating that it could not be older than 1762 when the British ware was introduced. Being that the unit was already in water and the soil had been sterile for about 20 centimeters, we halted this excavation in hopes of being able to come back when it was drier. This unit here only made it to about 110 centimeters before it was inundated. Once we get this amount of water, it makes it difficult to excavate. The water obscures color changes, which would indicate changes in periodic deposits. Pumps are always used to power through when necessary, but after a foot or so of sterile clay, the unit's usually shut down. Typically, we'll place an auger, like a corkscrew, in the bottom, and we'll try to find if there's any kind of deposits below that we'll need to come back for. Nothing was found in this one or any other units below about 4 or 5 feet, 120, 150 centimeters. We did go deeper on most of the tests on the property. We went to about 2 meters, about 6.5 feet. So now forward to the actual construction project for which we were allowed to conduct limited monitoring. And trying not to halt the process of construction, we were still able to document several areas of 18th century intact deposits. The back building photograph here was demolished for the project to continue. That's the back building in color during our excavation of the well down there on the left. So that back building was demolished, and here's a photograph looking back towards Royal Street of the back of the Signouret property. A whole slew of deep pits were excavated by the contractors once the buildings were demolished. This pic is taken from the former garage, the old St. Louis Hotel ancillary wing turned WDSU TV studio, and it's looking to the rear of the Brulatour house. So that's the Brulatour house there, one of the ancillary wings, and then right through here is the carriageway to Royal Street. Now, this view is the same pit looking towards Charters, Toulouse Street. The corner wall with arrows signifies the back property line of the Signouret parcel. Note the dead man on the left side there. These were installed to stabilize the surrounding property's walls, which had been mutually supporting each other for hundreds of years. They're anchored in huge concrete footings, and we were able to get in before their installation to dig shovel tests. These tests identified brick floors, walls, and artifact deposits associated with the Great Fires, even a wall from the St. Louis Hotel ancillary wing. But these ginormous holes the contractors dug would prove to be the most effective method in discovering the elusive Founders Era deposit that the curators were looking for. In this elevator shaft excavation, we identified 3 heavy midden. One is the fire, visible to the right of the technician's head. The second is the earlier 18th century brick black band to the right of her striped shirt in here. And the third is the earliest 18th century deposit in the floor of the trench to the right of the north arrow, down in here. So by the time we came out there, they had already removed this part, and we saw this midden down in there, and the fire all the way up here. Note the extreme depth, it's over her head. The red line across the photo is the very rear of the Signouret property, just to get a little more perspective. And the midden is down with the blue and red arrow. The dead man shown to the right, and that'll come in a little bit later. We just missed the midden with our dead man test. A closer look at the stratigraphy here reveals little bits of faience, kind of highlighted in the white, and the black specks are glass. There are a lot of bottles and things in there, and it's a woody black organic deposit. So shown on the 1731 Gonachon map, this is right at the back of the property. That lower midden is almost a meter deep than the 1790s fire. The floor of this deep deposit is approximately 215 centimeters below the surface of the courtyard. That's about 7 feet. So before that building was demolished, when we got to go in and dig in the dead man area, this one square in the bottom left corner is Dead Man 5, the picture that we've been seeing. So we were able to dig a little hole in there and document 2 brick floors at 32 and 69 centimeters, a heavy midden in dark silty soils, which turned out to be the fire midden between 110 and 135 centimeters. It's about 3.5, 4.5 feet. And below the soils went sterile gray clay until the test was abandoned at almost 2 meters. And it's really frustrating because you can see in this picture that the midden is really healthy here, but right here it goes back to gray clay. Yeah. So we dug all the way down right to here, and it was right there, that much. But at least we were able to get a sample of really cool artifacts from a pure French deposit, and although the construction activities nuked much of the 1788 and 94 fire deposit, the rest of the earliest midden had already been impacted as much as it was going to be impacted, so it's waiting there for future archaeologists preserved in place. And now we'll pivot to hear more on these cool artifacts from Elizabeth.
Let's hope this goes smoother. So many of you are going to recognize some of the artifacts from this presentation from the display for the New Orleans, the Founding Era exhibit. So before we get to speaking about those, we're briefly going to contrast some of the late colonial deposits from the Spanish occupation that came before it, and then go in depth into discussing the deposits from the Founding Era. So we date the top stratigraphy from the Spanish colonial era because the proportion of ceramics favor wares produced in England, available to the colonies beginning in 1760s. These wares, beginning with creamware, revolutionized the ceramic market, and it became incredibly popular throughout the Old and New Worlds. Archaeology throughout the French Quarter demonstrates that by the 1788-1794 fires, creamware and its younger counterpart, pearlware, were widely available and became common tableware settings in New Orleans. This fire in the Signouret wall is signified by the top black stratum. It is full of cinder and ash and actually has a smoky smell to it still. It was full of burnt creamware sherds. The silty layer below produced a proportion of ware associated with the Spanish colonial occupation, usually between 1760s and 1788 or 1794, depending on the date of this fire lens above it. The layer was likely formed from years of periodic flooding, and then attempts to build up the property to prevent episodes from recurring. So briefly, as a point of comparison, the assemblage from the Spanish colonial period was marked by a proportion of English wares, including creamware and pearlware vessels, a lingering collection of tin enamel earthenwares, mostly faience from France, but some Maholica vessels as well, produced from Spanish colonies. Utilitarian or storage vessels are present as well, mostly lead glazed or coarse earthenwares, including some low-fired wares that could be from Aboriginal or European tradition. Beneath the late colonial silty layer, there are two middens or trash levels and a less productive silty layer in between that had an assemblage of artifacts interpreted to the French colonial era. In total, these three layers produce sherds from at least 10 ceramic vessels, at least 15 glass vessels, one pipe stem, one metal unidentified object. For once edible items included a bone from sheep's head fish, an oyster shell, and 14 botanical seeds. Ceramics from the base layer, the very deepest, featured a variety of vessels with differing styles and motif, all clearly traced to French production. This layer appears to be what is called a French horizon, which is a term that archaeologists use to describe stratigraphy from the French territories that are only productive of artifacts clearly sourced from France. All of the tableware pieces in this assemblage are called faience blanche, a term used when both the interior and exterior of a coarse earthenware vessel is coated with a white tin enamel and then fired. Jason Emery, local archaeologist and specialist of faience, discusses in his thesis how this faience was produced, and that some manufacturing processes are evident on French vessels like this one. These marks were formed from sagre pins or pernets that would have supported the back of the vessel during firing after the biscuit was coated with tin enamel. Designs were applied to the interiors or exteriors, either hand-painted directly or pre-drawn on paper and then powdered. The pigment was transferred to the vessel by a variety of small punctures on a stencil-like paper. The vessel on the left is a plate that displays a rounded edge and is decorated in polychrome hand-painted design that appears to be double chevron separated by scrolls between parallel bands. Other classification systems discuss that this vessel is in the style of Moustier, which is a region in southern France. They are also often described as Provence blue on white, commonly found on colonial sites in the southeast. The vessel on the right could be a plate or platter. It has a scalloped edge, and it could be have served many one person or many people foods like oysters and meats, etc. The decoration on the interior rim of this vessel is hand-painted with a monochrome blue. Common typology discusses this vessel design as Normandy blue on white in a style of Rouen, which is in a region in northern France. So complete vessels of this kind would feature multiple frames that would continue along the interior rim that include floral pendants and other geometric designs involving diagonal lines, grids, and dots. The interior base of this vessel includes small points of color along the edge of the plate break along the bottom. Oh, sorry, I flipped out over a long time ago. And likely this vessel included an interior hand-painted design in the middle, such as a floral bouquet or a geometric pattern. So this next vessel is a faience pot, characterized by its height being approximately 1/3 the size and width of the vessel. The vessel includes a portion of the body where a handle would have attached and likely could have been designed to hold stews or soups. The decoration somewhat varies from traditional French, as it is polychromatic but without any blue color. And although this piece is atypical in French color scheme, the floral display is definitely French, and this type of decoration is common in southeast Louisiana. The design is also called Seine polychrome and is suggested that it is in the style of pieces produced in the Rouen region as well. The next vessel is from also the deepest midden. It is represented by a burnt base sherd from a coarse earthenware storage vessel. It is identified by its yellow lead-glazed interior as a traditional vessel from Biot in the Provence region of southern France. These Provence or Biot jars are generally large vessels, characterized by rounded rims and stand a few feet tall. These storage vessels are frequent on New Orleans 18th and 19th century sites and even occur occasionally in late 19th century assemblages. So the next set of ceramics come from the upper midden. We know by its position to be younger than the base midden, but still older than the fire of 1788 or 1794. So this lens had only a few ceramic tablewares that we could use to date it, and it too had a very different assemblage from the artifacts from the strata above it and below it. In fact, none of the ceramics from this layer are unequivocally French at all, but within the proportion of ceramics vessels in this layer, there is still no creamware present, indicating that it was likely deposited before the 1760s and within the French colonial era. Representing the ceramic tableware assemblage in this strata, none were faience or tin enamel earthenware, but rather porcelain. Porcelain vessel types were typically reserved for fine decorative tableware or tea sets. Porcelain is a ceramic ware type known because it is translucent. Additionally, the decorative glaze fuses to the paste. Early period porcelains are typed as hard paste or soft paste, and while both were available in French colonial period, both pieces in this assemblage were identified as hard paste porcelain teacups. Usually hard paste porcelain vessels during the early 18th century were almost invariably Asian, as this teacup rim likely was. Although potters on the continent of Europe were attempting to reproduce the quality of porcelain exported from China and occasionally Japan, they were largely unsuccessful until closer to the 19th century. But close inspection of this second hard paste porcelain teacup, the exterior and interior view are shown here. It has a blue underglazed hand-painted crescent moon maker's mark displayed on the exterior base. Multiple sources derive this maker's mark to Worcester Porcelain, a company from England, which, like other English porcelain manufactories, were known for soft paste porcelain. However, Worcester Porcelain Company also imported Chinese hard paste porcelain biscuit wares, decorated them in England, and then exported the final product for a period of time between 1751 and 1800, often including their well-known crescent moon maker's mark on the back of these hard paste porcelain vessels. The decorative style of this cup is suggestive of the English mimicry of Asian design, in this case including a rising sun design on the interior vessel base. A similar rising sun motif was noted in pearlware vessel from the deposit from the Spanish colonial era above, further suggesting that the decoration, if not the vessel body, was of English origin. The final ceramic vessel from the upper midden is a green lead-glazed redware, and it is likely French, although it is not from any specific ceramic French regional tradition. The vessel's rim profile is slightly indented, suggesting that the original vessel form was a basin to hold liquid, or perhaps even a milk pan. There's a sloppy execution of the glaze over the rim onto the exterior of the vessel, suggesting that the vessel was utilitarian in nature and not intended for display. As for glassware on the site, the proportion of glasswares to ceramics from the French colonial era as a whole was 3-2. The glass came almost exclusively from the bottom midden. The majority of the vessels appear to be wine bottles like this one, with the long neck and squat body that is suggestive of wine bottles manufactured from France from around 1800. 2 glass tumblers and a dessert glass were also part of the glass assemblage. The high count of glassware suggests that wine and drink were also perhaps disproportionately represented in the early colonial foodways, which also corresponds to the ruckus reports of the early days of this port city. One account of the superfluous use of drink in New Orleans is described in Shannon Doty's article on colonial foodways, in which a visiting French merchant, Caillot, describes a remedy prescribed to him at a New Orleans inn, which included drinking, quote, 2 bottles of bourbon wine in one sitting, followed by several gulps of brandy, to induce vomiting to cure his tropical fever. Even today, extreme versions of this remedy are still recommended to visitors from the French Quarter. The proportion of glassware to ceramics typically diminishes in later 18th to 19th century archaeology deposits. In fact, glass vessels were barely represented in the Spanish colonial assemblage above these early layers. Glass bottles were typically imported from Europe until glass was sourced from the United States in the mid-19th century. Between the founding era colonization and the postbellum deposits, glass acquisition was rather expensive and more difficult to come by. The glass vessels were often repurposed, or ceramic jugs and urns often substituted for containers for drink. Here is an unusual example of a repurposed glass bottle that was excavated at another portion of the property. It was without a clear historical context. No other artifacts were in the same strata to date it, but it was full of over 300 little lead BBs. So we interpret that this bottle was a container for birdshot. The discovery of 300 BBs in the bottle was a really exciting day at the lab, more so because we usually clean historic bottles out with steel BBs. So finding a historic bottle with a historic built-in cleaning supply was really nifty. Alright, so back to the artifacts in the elevator shaft. We're just going to finish by discussing what had been edible. The only faunal material came from the early colonial deposit was, as mentioned, a sheep's head fish and a large oyster shell. So we interpret that this area wasn't typically used for disposal or preparation of animal remains, or we just didn't find them. Early colonial faunal assemblages might include animal remains from domesticated animals, such as cow and pig and maybe goat or sheep, and mixed with some other wild animals, including bird or waterfowl, rabbits, turtles, occasionally deer, and finally, as Ryan mentioned, local fish, like sheep's head relating to fishing and the oyster that we found in the Signouret deposit. The botanicals, however, were better represented. They were hand-collected from both middens and sent to a specialist for analysis. All right, so the first, in both the upper and the lower layer, we found these organic conglomerate with small seeds inside, identified to be cane fruit, which means either raspberry or blackberry. And similar seeds were also noted at the base layers below. So blackberry and raspberry, as everyone knows, are plentiful vines around the southeast. They are likely harvested for their fruit and likely local, but the exact genus wasn't, or the exact variety wasn't able to be identified. We also found watermelon seeds from both the upper and lower middens. Watermelons were likely introduced to the New World from Africa via European colonists in the 16th and 17th centuries. However, it appears that Native Americans in the lower Mississippi Valley had since been cultivating them in the New World and then reintroduced them to the French colonists. Plum pit remains included pits from both, again, upper and lower layers of the midden. Of both middens. They could have had local or foreign counterparts that, again, couldn't be identified to a specific variety. So they could have been locally sourced or harvested or introduced and cultivated, or some combination in between. Only 2 varieties were recovered from only the base layer and included 1 persimmon seed. So the fruit comes from a persimmon tree, which occurs locally in Louisiana. And the second was a seed from a single passion fruit, also called maypop or pomegranate vine. So in general, for all the plants, these plants could have been harvested from the wild, but many of them could also have been part of an ornamental and or edible garden. Passion fruit, for example, comes from a plant with a very attractive flower that is grown in many gardens even today. Plum and persimmon trees likely have beautiful flowers. They could have been grown for fruit as well as the attractive addition to a household landscape. As mentioned, the elevator shaft was positioned in the back area of 52224 Royal Street, or what it is today. But what had been originally planned to be there was a parterre garden, strengthening the possibility that cultivated plants were grown in this area and were both edible and ornamental. The assemblage derived from the elevator shaft is limited in size. However, it is intact. This sample supports a historical narrative and material record from early colonial assemblages that suggests a founding assemblage sourced from French materials. Faience tablewares and wine bottles, likely French, dominated the early colonial assemblage. The upper layer includes a diversity of ceramic material in what we interpret to be the later period of the French colonial era. As the French crown subsequently neglected the New Orleans colony soon after its founding, it could fit that sources of French goods once prescribed by the French crown replaced materials that had been previously supplied from France. The two strata of French colonial midden, both positioned well beneath the fire lens of 1788 and 94, the younger with imported wares but without the presence of creamware, the older with pure French horizon of goods sourced exclusively from France, appears to be exciting samples of goods available to the colonial market in the early years of the New Orleans founding era. Thank you. All right, so now Ryan's going to come up and give the last piece of the presentation, and then we're going to look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike and Elizabeth, and thanks, everyone. I'll just be very brief here, and just to think a little bit about where we go from here. You know, archaeology is something that is obviously not easy to do in an environment like we have here in New Orleans. It can be slow and expensive. Developers and property owners are afraid of things being found that somehow slow down what they want to do or that cost them money, or both. And here in Louisiana, people don't like being told what they have to do with their property, something that preservation organizations all over the world are constantly running into. Nevertheless, some cities have had a great deal of success with archaeology protections. These don't necessarily prevent development. They just ask that historic resources be taken into account, taken into consideration. And St. Augustine, Florida is perhaps the most prominent example of this approach. But many other municipalities do this. When someone has to get a city permit for construction, if it's something that is large enough that it's not a single family or dual family home, then there are zones of archaeological sensitivity defined where the most sensitive require some sort of assessment in advance of the project, with the most sensitive usually being cemeteries, with places that are known for being cemeteries. I bring this up because we are going to talk a lot about preservation this year, and we need to preserve that which actually is endangered, that which can tell us about things that we don't already know, things that can add voices to our past, that can remedy silences that are built into the historical record. As the city consciously examines its heritage and its history, the lack of any formal archaeological plan for the city will become more and more evident, and perhaps there will finally be some momentum to make something happen with that this year. I always return to the case of the St. Peter Street Cemetery, and think about it in relation to the African burial ground in New York, the excavation of which, or the discovery of which, and subsequent excavation caused a sensation. The situation there was different. It was a federally funded project, and as such, federal laws kicked in and gave some protections for remains of the site, mandated certain actions. But one might very reasonably ask why all these different rediscoveries of the St. Peter Street Cemetery haven't drawn comparable attention. The African burial ground is now a national monument, and there's still not a marker designating where the St. Peter Street Cemetery is, nor are there any special protections for the site, despite the fact that we have a reasonable degree of certainty that at least 8,000, maybe as many as 12,000 of our city's first residents are buried on that block. These residents, whether white or black or Indian, or sometimes all three, they show up differentially in documents, but they are all represented there. And I hope that's something that, in this tricentennial year that at least deserves some recognition in the future of the city. So we'll open it up to questions there.
Mics are on, so we're good to go. Thank you all so much for those three wonderful presentations that we had. Yes. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question? We've got one right here in the front row.
In the book Unfathomable City, Nathaniel Rich wrote an article about remains in Frenchport cemeteries, and he mentions that at least some of the remains were moved to a spot in Lakeview near the lake. And there's a map associated with the article. And there's a little area called Phillipsburg Park on Katina Street in Lakeview. It says cemetery, if I recall. I'm assuming that's where the remains were moved. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, just to repeat, you're asking about a map that's There's a write-up in Unfathomable City about forgotten cemeteries in New Orleans, especially forgotten cemeteries, and there's a map that shows some of those. There's some good historical information there. The St. Peter Street Cemetery, what I can speak to most definitely is, there's very little evidence that anyone was ever moved from there, and certainly no one from there was moved out to Lakeview. Now, there are other cemeteries that are built over all around the city as well, including some that are very near the French Quarter, and there are some undoubtedly that have human remains that have been moved. But more often what happens, if you ask any archaeologist who works in cemeteries, is that when people say they move human remains, they move headstones, and maybe interested families will come and do something about moving their own family members, but otherwise it's very rare for people to get moved. There are a number of places, other places around the city where human remains have been encountered at different places over the years, from larger underground cemeteries. There are a lot more underground cemeteries than people remember these days around the city.
Okay, we have a question right here.
I remember when they were, just a couple years ago, when they were redoing the tearing down the Iberville project, they found, I think, some human remains from, it would have been from St. Louis number 1 when it was buried. Whatever, was there a dig done there? Whatever happened with that?
That was us. Basically, the maps from the 1800s showed the cemetery as it was, as built. It went back St. Louis Street all the way past Murray Street, and it went down Basin Street for a little dog leg of half a block. So when we delineated and dug tests through there, we found human remains in every trench that we dug in that area that was on the footprint of the Zimpel map and other maps in the early antebellum periods. So when that happened, we just covered them back up and told our clients that, yes, this is what we were telling you was here. You shouldn't have planned the whole project before you brought us out. Little ha-ha, you people. And then it's going to be green space now. So none of that was ever dug up, and as you can see that project progressing, it's progressing all around that footprint of St. Louis number 1 as it was originally.
Yeah, and just to add a little sense to that, there is actually a state cemetery statute that is very difficult to enforce in urban environments, but the state legislature wrote a cemetery statute that basically says unless a cemetery is deconsecrated, it should remain as cemetery space. Now, the state lawmakers who wrote that weren't thinking about archaeology at all, and they weren't thinking about the implications of that. And that something like that in a densely developed city where the oldest parts of the city have been built over for so long, I mean, it's something that's almost unthinkable, unenforceable. But that's what the state, that is what the state law in Louisiana says.
Dr. Gray, if I were facing the Portuguese Society tomb, do you know which vault was used to put the remains in 2015?
Yes, and there is actually a marker on the vault.
There's one on the side, but I'm talking about
Oh, actually, like which one out? It was the, let's see. It's been a while since I've been back there. I think it was about the 7th or 8th up on the 2nd row over from the left. I'd have to look back at my notes to make sure on that.
I'll email you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a question back here, ma'am.
Yes, I was wondering if there has been a report about the results of what remains like where she's talking. Was there any report made about what they found from those remains?
Would you repeat the question?
Oh, certainly. Just if there had been a report prepared for those investigations at the St. Peter Street Cemetery, I assume. There are actually 2 reports that have been produced that are on file with the state. A forensics report prepared by the LSU FACES lab, and a report that we prepared at UNO on that investigation that has some discussion about the implications of what we found there. There was also a report prepared about the 1984 excavations. So there's that much on file out there, and can be accessed through the State Division of Archaeology, or I'm happy to share that information with people as well.
Yes, sir?
I had understood that on the other side of the street, on the river side of the St. Peter Cemetery, had been an original dump site of the city. Is that true?
And this is something that Mike and Elizabeth may know something about it as well. I mean, basically the dump sites for the city kind of change over time to wherever, as the boundaries of the city change, the dump site becomes kind of just outside of that boundary. And you can actually trace really well the historic development of the city by kind of looking for these dump sites that are constantly forming at the periphery. In one of the other kind of famous 80s discoveries of human remains at the foot of Canal Street, there's actually a huge dump site there on top of the late 19th century cemetery that, you know, was put in place at the time when development was getting to that point of the city. So, you know, the developmental sequence tends to go cemeteries abandoned, dump, and then people eventually kind of move over on top of it.
Last question.
Do you want anything to add to that? Yeah, well, we did excavate that same one that you're talking about around Canal Boulevard, and that's exactly is what we found. In fact, they actually had filled in the Metairie Bayou at that point, and then you could see this like perfect layer of midden around like about 1.5 feet deep, and then just barely less than a foot underneath. Oftentimes you would find where the burials would start. So there wasn't, in some places, a whole lot of time for them to have really used the land for too long before they just started dumping over that.
All right, one last question. You had your hand up.
So you're saying that from the first fire in 1788, when you found stuff, then they rebuilt, and then the next fire happened. So when that burned, that was the next set of artifacts that you found?
In some portions of the property, that could be what had happened. Some of the areas, especially towards the Royal Street, we do believe that we might have found 2 burn lenses. However, further back behind Royal Street, we weren't really sure which burn layer we were working with because the maps of the fire and how fire tends to move.
Right.
There was only one midden.
Yeah, there's only one fire lens. The other midden, like the more younger of the 2 middens from the French colonial era, was actually very woody in deposit. It was almost wet, and so it was not the similar type of fire lens that we knew to be from the French fires in 1788 and 1794. We just weren't able to date the one in the back of the property.
All right, well, thank y'all so much.